This is Lesson 17.3, The Growth of Rural Industry. How and why did rural industry intensify in the 18th century? College Board Topic 3.3 says continuities and changes to economic practice and development. Economic development, especially the development of capitalism, played an important role in Europe's history, often having significant social, political, and cultural effects. We're sure going to see that here. Labor and trade in commodities were increasingly freed from traditional restrictions imposed by governments and corporate entities. We might see that as somewhat. Here's this second thing here, that's where we're really going to see. The putting out system, or cottage industry, expanded as increasing numbers of laborers in the homes or workshops produced for markets through merchant intermediaries or workshop owners. We're still around England, and so we're just using this same map here. It's going to leave the impression that this is one of my favorite maps, but England is where we're kind of really starting out. Key concepts of the growth of rural industry. One term that our textbook likes to use is the Industrious Revolution. I think they got that from some author. It's kind of clever because this is a development that predates the Industrial Revolution, so they call it the Industrious Revolution. Cottage industry, the putting out system, and capitalism. So why was there a growth in rural industry? We've already seen how the agricultural revolution made it possible to grow a whole lot more food with a whole lot less labor. And all that food is going to lead to a population increase and then to a population explosion. So that's what we've seen in 17.1 and 17.2. Agricultural laborers need other kinds of work to supplement their income from agriculture because there simply isn't as much agricultural work for them to do anymore. Urban capitalists see a huge opportunity here. Why not employ all these extra hands to manufacture simple consumer goods out in the country for sale to the public? You can pay them a lot less than what that same labor costs in the city. Rural peasants are already used to making a lot of consumer goods for themselves. Now you can take advantage of those same rudimentary skills to make things for sale in a large and growing market. The population is growing because of all the food, so the demand for consumer goods is going to grow right along with it. Hence, cottage industry. The definition of cottage industry is manufacturing things at home with hand tools for commercial sale. It's going to be a huge part of the economy. It's going to be one of the doors that opens the way to the Industrial Revolution. So here's the basic structure of a system called the putting out system. This goes hand in hand with this idea of cottage industry. The urban merchant, he's the key player here. He goes out and he buys the raw materials and then he puts them out at the worker's home. So he literally delivers or has delivered those raw materials to that worker's front door. Then that rural hand worker processes those raw materials into a finished product. The merchant then picks the finished product back up from the rural worker's house. He pays the worker for his labor very cheaply, and he sells that finished product at market. Now, this model had endless variations depending on what the product was, how it was processed, how many steps it took to process that, how many different types of workers there were. It depended on the complexity of the process, etc. Features of this putting out system. The good thing about the putting out system was, number one, it was unregulated. And that meant that regular people out in the country could do the work without interference from some urban trade guild, because the trade guild, they can't get out there and regulate all that work that's going on out there. They can't control that. And that's good for the merchant. The types of products that were made: textiles, housewares, buttons, gloves, clocks, even wet nursing services, etc. And of all of those things, textiles was the largest segment of cottage industries. Many houses had a family spinning wheel and a hand loom for doing this work, and the whole family would take part in the spinning and the weaving. Products not made by cottage industry were luxury goods like tapestries, fine clothes, lace, patent leather like patent leather shoes, fancy things, fine wines, porcelain. By 1700, the English industry was more rural than it was urban. And that's kind of ironic because typically, it's in the urban centers where manufactured goods are made. But here it was more rural than urban. And economies, European economies, heavily relied on this putting out system. And it established important foundations, like I said, for the coming Industrial Revolution. The lives of rural workers. Spinning and weaving textiles was, number one, a family affair. Everybody's involved. And number two, done at home. The dad typically did the weaving on the hand loom. The kids spun the thread for him. The kids couldn't spin fast enough to keep up with how fast the dad could weave. So merchants would hire rural widows and single women as spinsters because they spun thread, see that, to supplement the needs that these household weavers had for more thread. These urban merchants didn't pay these female spinsters nearly what they paid their male weavers. They figured the dad had a family to support. Often so did widows, but merchants tended not to see that. And a spinster's pay was usually barely enough to live on. Merchants tended to see the situation differently. We're still out in the country, and these rural women didn't have time to do all that spinning during the planting and harvesting seasons. And merchants saw this disruption of their business as laziness. And so if a spinster could afford to take all this time off, then it must mean that they were being paid too much. And so merchants reasoned that they needed to keep wages very low to encourage these women to work more. There was massive distrust between urban capitalist merchants and rural cottage industry workers. Workers accused merchants of underweighing the bales of wool that the merchants brought to them. Merchants accused rural workers of stealing their raw materials and doing shoddy work. Merchants often tried to have rural workers tried and punished for pilfering. But rural workers often saw it as their right to glean the leftovers. They had always had the right to glean the fields when they had farmed. The Industrious Revolution. What you have is you've got a shift in work habits that occurred in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Households started working harder. They reduced their amount of leisure time. They worked more hours and worked faster. Households increased the number of wage workers in the family. Women shifted from making household goods to doing wage work, in other words, being paid by the hour. And doing this enabled households to purchase more goods because they had more cash now, more wages coming in. Sacrificing so that you can buy more stuff, as we see here, is not new. Women in the labor market. Women almost always worked menial jobs. They were low-wage jobs. They were tedious jobs. And these women often used their income to buy household necessities that they were too busy working to make themselves. And therefore, women actually helped the growth of the very industries that they often worked in as consumers, as customers. So what was the effect of this shift in household dynamics? The creation of households where all the members are now wage earners. They're no longer working in the, quote, family business, and households increasingly relied on buying manufactured consumer goods rather than making these goods at home. And another shift, women were 40% of the total workforce.